Hello, podcast listeners. Stephen Gray here. I salute both of you. How's it going? I am talking to you now through my new equipment which has come in. I now have mic stands and pop filters which are keeping the mics at a very, very comfortable position where I no longer have to lean into my table to get the sound hitting the microphone at the right angle. This podcast marks the return of my buddy Terry Strickland. If y'all listen to Podcast 001, you'll know that Terry is the founder and lead strategist at Tangerine, a digital agency in Pensacola, Florida, dedicated to helping businesses and brands at the intersection of food, technology, and social good. I had some great feedback on episode 001 with Terry. I didn't have a ton of listeners, obviously. It was the first one to hit the web, but all the feedback I received was unanimously positive, so I'm thankful to all of you who gave me that feedback. So I decided to have Terry on for a chapter 2 while I book some other guests who will be coming probably in about a week and a half from the launch of this episode. My original intent for this episode was to return to the Carroll County stories that everyone loves so much from the first podcast. But that didn't really happen, and to be honest, I'm fine with that, because Terry kicked us off with some cool material that he had been hiding away to bring to the podcast for some time, and then he went into another piece that I won't spoil for you here, but it's a very special story about a very unique person. Once Terry finished reading it, it's a piece he wrote back in college. Once he finished reading it, I felt like I'd been punched in the stomach. I felt genuinely touched and said, Terry, let's call it. Because it was just, it was an emotion I wanted to stay with us for a little while because it was very, very good. This episode is a little shorter than the last one. This runs about 45 minutes as opposed to an hour and a half. So whether you're in your car, taking a jog, at the gym, wherever, I invite you to enjoy this second round with Terry Strickland. Three, two, one, we're live. What's going on, Terry?
Oh, stuff, things.
You going to the places and doing the things?
Mm-hmm. All of the places, all of the things.
Nice. Well, you came in here a little while ago. I should backtrack. We had, I didn't get a ton of responses on that last podcast we did, but the ones I got were universally positive. Everyone really enjoyed hearing you, not just your mission now, but, everyone really loved your stories about Arkansas. So people kept saying, when you got to have him back? So it's been about 10 days. I figured it was time to go ahead and strike while the iron was hot, while stuff was fresh, and get you back in here. And I know we're going to get to that, but you came in with a newspaper, and you said that there was something in there you wanted me to hear that was pretty fun.
Oh, yeah. So on the subject of small town newspapering, I have this habit every time I go on a road trip and I drive through a small town, stop to get gas or get a cup of coffee. I always stop and try and pick up a copy of the local paper, just because I love small town newspapers, and it's always interesting to see what winds up in them, So I was on a road trip to, I want to say it was Atlanta, not long ago, and stopped to get gas and picked up a copy of the local newspapers, the Evergreen Current. And this paper is dated Thursday, August 11th, 2016. It's the Evergreen Current from Evergreen, Alabama.
I've been through there a few times.
Have you?
Yeah. Nice little town.
It is. So anyway, I was reading through it. I picked it up, and the top headline was "Police Make Rare LSD Arrest." That's nice. In Evergreen, Alabama, that's rare.
It's the story of the South, though.
Yeah.
Rare arrests.
Troopers worked 6 wrecks. Rewards set for stolen firearms. County okays new Jenny for tower, whatever a Jenny is.
Generator?
That's probably, that makes sense. But then, you flip to beneath the fold, and you see this headline, "Ghostly Photo Taken," and there's a picture here of what looks to be just a regular person walking past a game camera. It's blurred, as photos taken from game cameras usually are when someone's walking quickly. But yeah, "Ghostly Photo Taken" by Joe Thomas, editor of the Tri-City Ledger. And I just wanted to read this because this is by far the best story I have ever found on one of these little small town adventures. All right, so I'm gonna read this. It's gonna take a minute. I'm warning you. This is very long. I think the Evergreen Current devoted more column inches to this story than most newspapers did to Comey's testimony today. Big news. John and Faye Gandy got a neighbor to set up a game camera near their 3185 Old Atmore Road residence in Flomaton in hopes of capturing possible trespassers and drug dealers, but instead got a shock when the camera caught what the Gandys say is a ghost. John Gandy said they've had problems with people coming in and out of the road next to their home, and noted their garbage dumpster has a pair... Oh, I got to turn the page. Sorry. Noted their garbage dumpster has apparently become a neighborhood dump. Bill Purdy set up the game camera to see who was coming and going. It was that surveillance that captured the photograph of the possible ghost. We didn't think much of it at first, but Faye and I talked and said, call old Joe and see if he would like to see a real live ghost and put it in the paper, John said.
Love that dialect.
Thank you. John and Faye determined the image caught on the camera was the ghost of a Confederate soldier standing guard, holding a rifle. The Gandys aren't the only ones to think it was a ghost. When we first saw it, we thought, what in the world? John said. There were probably 1,000 pictures. We had some people walking by, people on four-wheelers, but only one that looked like that. John noted that the game camera is movement activated, noting the ghost must have walked in front of the lens. When I saw it, it looked like somebody walking with a gun, John recalled. I showed it to my wife, and the only thing we could come up with was it was a ghost. Faye said the ghost appears to be walking south, obviously, right? I mean, come on.
Of course, yeah.
It's not going to be walking north, right? Carrying a rifle. Like her husband, Faye said the camera was put up to see who was dumping trash in the garbage container, noting several times they found paraphernalia and other drug-related items in their dumpster. Faye said she's never noticed anything unusual that would make her think a ghost was nearby. But if anything, it may stay in an old house behind their house. Obviously, right? I never felt of any ghosts around here, Faye said. I wouldn't be afraid. I'm not a bad person, and a ghost wouldn't bother me anyway. But now it makes me wonder about some of the things I've heard at night, she added. Faye said it was early in the morning when the ghost came by and simply showed up on the game camera. It looked like a man, and Bill said it looked like he had a gun, Faye said. She said a lot of Confederate soldiers were in the area and went to Pollard during the war. She recalled hearing about ghosts and other strange things at Pollard. She said that years ago, someone was killed inside a Pollard store, and despite efforts to clean up the blood, it just kept coming back. The old store was eventually torn down. There aren't many ghosts, Faye said, but we've got one carrying a gun. People sneaking around my house at night might want to know that I've got a gun, too. Since the original sighting, neither Purdy nor the Gandys have captured any more pictures, but they noted that the camera is still up just in case the ghost comes back. Was it a ghost? Was it a Confederate soldier? Kevin McKinley, commander of the William Carney Sons of Confederate Veterans Camp 2088 in Escambia County, Alabama, and Tri-City Ledger columnist, said he wouldn't rule it out. If you had told me that picture was taken along Highway 31, I'd be a little bit more skeptical, he said. But if you look at a map, Old Atmore Road was the route that Confederate soldiers traveled and guarded during the war. McKinley said Pollard was one of the largest Confederate bases during the Civil War, and that soldiers were dispatched to guard the roads. He said the current route of Old Atmore Road was such a route from Jack Springs to Pollard. It's highly likely that Confederate soldiers patrolled that area, he said. He added that there are 23 unmarked graves in Hall Cemetery in Canoe, the town of Canoe, obviously. And most people believe that those graves belonged to Confederate soldiers. People lived along that roadway during the war, McKinley said of Old Atmore Road. Is it a Confederate soldier? I think anything's possible. There are definitely things out there that we just can't explain. But I do know the Old Atmore Road was guarded and patrolled during the war, and I am 99.9% sure there was a route Confederate soldiers traveled. So it makes sense. Evergreen resident Luther Upton said that while he hasn't seen the picture, he knows ghosts are real because he lived with some years ago. Upton said he rented a house built in 1827 in the Belleville community of Conecuh County, Alabama. He said he rented the house from Herbert C. Cannon because Cannon just couldn't deal with the ghosts. I guess he thought I could go out there and deal with them, Upton said. But he didn't tell me there were ghosts there. Upton said he later traced the history of the house and found out that Confederate Colonel Hawthorne's son Joseph was killed by a slave named Free John. Free John was brought back and hanged. That is what it actually says. But Upton thinks Joseph was one of the ghosts in the house. He said the house was later sold to Dr. Shaw, and Upton said that once the Confederacy started losing the war, I'm just, as an aside, I love how people in the South still call the Civil War the war, as if it just happened like a few years ago.
Well, there's so many people that still have a Confederate flag on their back windshield. It's like a scab that hasn't quite healed over.
Yeah, it's the war as if it were still going on.
Yeah.
Like it's like, they just haven't conceded yet. Anyway, that's my own editorial commentary. So,
back to the article.
Started losing the war, the house was used as a hospital for Confederate soldiers. A lot of people died, and Dr. Shaw took them out and buried them in the backyard, Upton said. Upton said when he moved into the house around 1991 or 92, strange things began to happen. I never got a good look at the ghosts, just glimpses here and there, Upton said. He said during the night, furniture would get moved and the TV and radio would either be turned on or off. He said he figured at least one of the ghosts was Joseph. He didn't like Janis Joplin or Hank Sr., Upton said. If they were playing on the TV or the radio, they would be turned off. He said the ghosts made so much racket in the night, he'd have to get on to them. Does Upton believe in ghosts? He asks. Hell yes, he said. They can make some racket and just scare the hell out of you. Upton said he talked to some friends while he lived in the house and got the same advice. Move. I packed my bags and moved to Evergreen, Upton said. Upton also said he felt that at least one of the ghosts, probably Joseph, used to ride to work with his wife. That's why I think it was Joseph, because nothing bad ever happened, he said. He also recalled planting some green fields on either side of the house where you could hunt from the upstairs. He said his son was hunting one day from the upstairs and got so scared that he left the house. He started smelling smoke from a pipe, and nobody around was smoking a pipe, Upton said. It's scary. Some of those were Confederate boys buried out there. Upton said that a quote-unquote crackhead later burned down the old home place, but he feels the ghosts are still there. When asked if he would take someone to the site for an interview, Upton said he won't go back, but he'd point them in the right direction. And that's the end. I just have to point out that last paragraph is my favorite part because it just leaves you wondering, like, who was Joe, the editor of the Tri-City Ledger, going to interview? I mean, was he going to interview the ghosts? I mean, that's kind of the impression it leaves you with. So
yeah, they ended kind of on a note of whimsy.
Yeah,
I'll point you in the right direction.
Point you in the right direction. And I just have to say, I've developed a theory. I bring this newspaper article out at dinner parties from time to time. And read it, in character to the best of my ability, and it's always a hit.
Your characters are fantastic.
Thank you. I've done that enough at this point that I've started to develop kind of a theory about what actually happened here, and my theory is that this entire article was invented by Joe of the Tri-City Ledger for the benefit of his good friends, the Gandys, who were concerned about the drug dealers hanging out by their trash can, because I think that they're all just a bunch of racists and assume that if people believe that there's a ghost, and a ghost of a Confederate soldier no less, patrolling their trash can, that they won't have people hanging out anymore. Like, I think the whole thing is a big hoax. That's my theory anyway. I haven't called Joe to check, but
we should do that.
Yeah, I've thought about it.
I gotta find out a way to plug in the phones to the audio recorder, because that would be a very entertaining call. Just catch him at like noon on a Monday. He's eating a bologna sandwich at his desk and gets that call from over a year ago.
And I'm not trying to be a jerk. I mean, not everybody who lives in a small town in Alabama is racist, obviously. But it's such an absurd story. It kind of leaves you wondering, like, what were they thinking? Like, what in the world? I mean, they devoted half of the newspaper to this story.
I know, it was almost like a town hall meeting. They interviewed so many people
They
about
did.
this
This
little
is a
non-event.
5-source story. Like, this took some serious investment. But, to me, like the clincher, like what really, to me, cemented that idea in my head was this quote, which is like, I don't know, 20 paragraphs down from Faye Gandy, where she says, "There aren't many ghosts, but we've got one carrying a gun. People sneaking around my house at night might want to know that I've got a gun, too." So, yeah, that's what cemented it for me. It sounded like a warning to me.
And that's such an empty threat in the South, though. You go to Evergreen, Alabama, everyone's got a gun. Everyone's got a shotgun rack in their back seat.
But
and a
not
gun on their
everybody
hip.
has the ghost of a Confederate soldier carrying a gun.
Although I gotta say, there's almost like there's a good metaphor in there for the state of, all the people that are trying to keep the Confederacy alive. And I'm not immune to the sentiments behind it. A lot of people just honestly assume it's their Southern pride manifesting itself in this common expression of spirit. But the idea of the Sons of the Confederacy, their whole little movement they've kept going for the last 100-something years, is kind of accurately summed up in the idea of the ghost of a Confederate soldier patrolling a trash can.
Yeah, that's a good point. But I just love this story. I mean, like, it's just a gem. So I don't know. It reminds me of working at a small town newspaper too. Trying to fill column inches, and so all this talk about ghosts and newspaper work reminds me of another story. And this goes way back before I ever had my first newspaper job in Arkansas to when I was in college as a journalism student. I was taking this feature writing class. It was one of my last semesters in school, and I was working a lot. I was working at this late night diner, and I'd put in long hours. I'd work till like 2 o'clock in the morning, closing down shop, and then get up early to go to school. And so I was really overcommitted and wasn't doing too well in this class. I was afraid if I was going to pass or not. But the final project I remember was I had to write a personality profile, and I'd never written one before. And I was really struggling to figure out what I was going to write about, who I was going to write about. But I had this experience a couple months prior. When I was in college, whenever I wasn't working or in school, I would spend most of my free time just driving around, driving through neighborhoods I'd never been through before. And I still do that. I've always loved unfamiliar space. It's what inspires me most.
I like doing that too.
Yeah, I love that feeling of being somewhere you've never been before. And I love imagining what people's lives are like. Like as a writer, that's where I find my most inspiration. So on one of those trips, it was like late one night, and I was driving around through West Pensacola, and I turned down the street I'd never been down before, and drove to the very end of this residential road. It dead ended at this warehouse complex, and there was this gravel driveway. And I pulled down this gravel driveway to turn around, and it was then that I saw that the last house on this road, it was the most fascinating house I'd ever seen in my life. It was sort of this just jumble of junk. It was kind of, this house was pieced together like from old freezer doors and like old trailers and just like bits of sheet metal. And it was barely recognizable as a house. But there were junk sculptures all in the yard, and there were signs posted on all the trees that, had quotes painted on them. And I just remember thinking, God, whoever lives here must be really, really interesting. And so I put that, filed it away in my head and forgot about it until I had this assignment. And I was trying to think of, what characters I knew who might be interesting to write about. And I remembered this place, and I thought, maybe that's where I should write about. So I wound up going back and, meeting this gentleman who lived there and writing a story about him, which actually saved my ass. I wound up passing the class because of that story. I got a perfect grade on it because my professor fell in love with the piece. But it was also sort of, it made me fall in love with, with writing about people. So I'm going to read that story that came out of that. And it's called Maybe Love is a Hurricane-Proof Bed. Names have been changed for protection of the innocents. I parked my car on the curb across the street from John's house. It was November 26th, Black Friday. The air was icy and smoke poured from the aluminum pipe in John's roof, blended with the thick gray clouds. Beneath the towering oaks, his yard was a jumble of antiquated machine parts, strange junk sculptures, and random scraps of metal. I approached the home cautiously. I was uneasy after our last encounter. From somewhere in the backyard, I heard the sound of a dog barking. "John!" I cried out. "Are you home?" It took a few minutes for him to emerge. He greeted me in the driveway with a ragged scrap of ham between his fingers. During our last visit, John had told me that he subsisted mostly on Waffle House coffee, ham, and pineapple sandwiches. He took a bite of ham and invited me inside. Money is tight. John used to be a manual laborer, but he's no longer able to do a full day of work due to his deteriorating health. His only source of income now is the money he makes by taking things to the scrapyard. I followed John through a side door. As we entered, he said, "I live a different life than most people." John asked how my Thanksgiving had been, and I told him it had been good. "I woke up yesterday morning to find that my little dog had died in the night," John said. Over the course of the day, he had learned that 3 other people he cared about had also died. "I don't always understand why God does things the way he does them," John said, "but I figure he must have a reason." The house was filled with the smell of smoke. I had been inside once before, but I still struggled to make sense of what I saw. Strange machines, antiques, and tools littered the cracked cement floor and hung from the exposed rafters. It was dark, and holes in the walls let the cold inside. I struggled to believe that John had lived here for 20 years. The place looked more suited to rats and ghosts than to a man. John asked me to have a seat and retrieved an old, filthy briefcase from the adjacent room. He set it at my feet. Inside were hundreds of sheets of paper. They were tattered and stained by age. More filthy briefcases contained more pages. On them, scrawled in ink or typed, were the collected works of John Doe. While I read, he stood in the center of the room and dipped an old shirt in a bucket of oil. Beside him, a rusted wood-burning stove rested on a white tire hub and 3 rusted irons. He removed an old pot from the stovetop and stuffed the oil-drenched clothes into the flames. He was boiling water for his bath. John might seem like an unlikely poet. He doesn't speak in iambic pentameter, and you won't find his poems in the latest issue of Harper's. When asked how he's doing, John is likely to respond by saying, "I'm finer than a frog's hair split 5 ways." He never progressed past the 7th grade, and he cannot read. John told me it was difficult to express the fullness of his experience in writing. Because of his lack of education, he doesn't know the right words to use, or by the time he gets what he is trying to say down on paper, he's forgotten what he wanted to write next. Despite all this, John has managed to write poems that are beautiful and skillful. They're about love and the beauty of nature. He writes perceptively about people, and he's sensitive to symbolism. Some of his metaphors are particularly striking because of their freshness. For instance, in one poem, he compared a heart touched by love to high-quality rubber, because it can be subjected to great stress and still maintain its shape. John's heart has been subjected to great stress. When I first asked him where he was born, he told me that he was born in the state of confusion. He was born into violence. The entirety of John's hometown lived in fear of his father, who John said could break every bone in a man's face with one punch. He did not spare his children in his rage. John's mother was a short, plump Choctaw woman, loved by everyone she knew. She died when John was 20 years old, and he subsequently raised his 4 siblings. Partly because of the hatred sown by his father, few people would give John work, so he turned to crime. He spent his nights robbing and butchering stolen cows to fill his siblings' stomachs. His life has been filled with bar brawls and brushes with the law, and though he claims to have not hit anyone in many years, the residue of John's violent past still clings to him. He is still filled with powerful rage. 2 days before sitting in John's dark living room before a rusty stove, I had sat with him at Waffle House. I studied his face from across the table. He looked to be about 60, with dark gray hair, bushy eyebrows, and a stubbly white beard. His eyes are blue. His gaze is intent and unflinching. There's some wildness in it. John's laugh is impossible to forget, a high, heaving, nasally sound that seems to quiver somewhere between intense joy and absolute madness. He has the muscular hands and the broad, blackened finger is grown from a lifetime of labor. His right index finger is severed beneath the middle knuckle. John held a cup of coffee and leaned in and out as he spoke. John told me he had once had a dog he loved very much. One day, for reasons I'm not sure of, a police officer arrived at John's home, which at that time was a red bread truck parked on T Street, to confiscate the dog. John leaned in, looked directly at me with his wild blue eyes, and yelled across the table, "If you take that dog, I will take your fucking head off." For a moment, I was terrified. I thought it was my head that was being threatened. But the storm shortly passed from John's eyes, and I realized it had all just been a part of the story. John had held a wrench in his hand when he threatened the police officer. Needless to say, he spent some time in jail after the incident. John is alone. He recently had a falling out with his siblings, and he doesn't believe they will ever be reconciled. He occasionally gets visitors, whom he gladly gives tours of his property. He shares his art, maybe even a poem or a song. But the visitors never stay for long. He's just a curiosity to them, and perhaps a bit insane. It seems that John's only constant companions are his two dogs, God, and the ghosts that visit him in the night. He paces the cement floor in his home, talking to God, begging him to tell him something, and he is sometimes visited by other spirits. John is superstitious. He is attentive to dreams and omens, and he credits this attentiveness with saving his life on more than one occasion. These types of experiences have been a part of his life since he was a young boy, and he said his mother also shared them. John cut up limbs with a skill saw in the middle of the room while I read his writings. He told me how he had befriended the man who owned a coffee shop up the road from his house. "I thought we were on the same page," John said. "He told me how he had died and come back to life. I thought that he shared my world. I thought he talked to God and saw things that other people didn't see." One day, the shop owner had brought an Indian friend to meet John, and the next week the two men's wives had come back to tour his property also. John had been very polite. He had tried not to curse, and he thought it went really well. That night, though, he had suddenly heard the disembodied voice of the Indian man talking to his wife. Though they were speaking in their own language, John said he had understood them. He said the man had been chastising his wife for having visited John alone. This made him angry. He said it made him so mad that he wanted to kill the man. The next time he saw the shop owner, he told him what he had heard, that his friend was no good. Upon hearing the story, the shop owner flinched, and John said it was then that he realized this man, he didn't share his world. "He did not live in my world," John said. There was genuine pain in his face as he said this. He told me that he didn't often share his experiences with people because they did not understand them. He is completely and utterly alone. John asked me to come outside. In the yard was the limb he had been burning. He explained to me how the limb had come to fall. He had been in his backyard drinking a beer with a friend. It had been a windless day. However, all of a sudden, John had heard a great snapping sound, and a huge limb had come crashing from the oak tree overhead and landed right beside him. John couldn't understand it. A rotten limb nearby had not fallen, and this limb was perfectly healthy. He thought that it must mean something. I struggled to understand why John put so much importance on this seemingly trifling matter. "If you believe in God, you are superstitious," John told me. I believe in God. If you're superstitious, if you believe in God, you have to take every little thing that happens seriously. You have to pay attention to the signs. There was silence for a moment. Then I asked him what exactly he thought this falling limb might have meant. "I don't know what the fuck it means," John replied. "That's why I keep asking God. What the fuck does this mean?" "I take everything seriously," he said. "Even your being here. I don't think that's by accident." Several days later, I came back to John's place. I found him in the backyard burning the fallen limb and eating a bag of Doritos. He offered me some. I said no thank you. During the course of our conversation, John asked me what it meant to love someone. I told him that I thought it meant to give somebody your attention. He said that made sense, though I didn't have to use a 3-cylinder word. He rephrased it using 1-cylinder words. John told me that loving someone meant giving them your time. Then he looked at me. His voice grew heavier and smoother with feeling. He said, "You've given your time to me, son. You didn't have to, but you've come to see me, and you've given me your time." When I left that day, John looked at me and thanked me for coming to visit. I could tell he meant it. As I left, I thought about how alone he must feel in his world, and I thought also about love. Besides being a poet, John makes sculptures from the refuse in his yard, and he's an inventor. The first time I ever visited his home, John took me on a tour of the property. He showed me his art, his eclectic collection of machines. Then inside, he showed me one of his proudest inventions, a hurricane-proof bed. Over the bed, constructed from scrap lumber, was a large support structure which John told me was intended to catch the roof and tree in the event of a cave-in. The bed sat atop 2 feet of styrofoam. In the event of flooding, the owner could float through the streets as if on a boat. Finally, the front of the bed was equipped with spotlights so that one could see where one was going. That was where John slept. At the time, I struggled to take the invention seriously, although he was clearly very serious about it. John told me he thought the invention could be marketed to hospitals, but his inability to read had hampered his attempts at marketing his product. As I turned off of John Street that day and onto the busy highway, I thought I finally understood. I thought maybe love is a hurricane-proof bed. When the spirits snap the limbs and they come crashing through the roof of our minds, when chaos screams down our throat, maybe love can catch the limb. Maybe love is equipped with spotlights. Maybe it can light our way through the darkness and keep us afloat, safe above the deluge. It might prove true in the end that love is just an idea, styrofoam and scrap lumber. Maybe when the storm finally comes, it won't really float at all. Then again, maybe it will. Maybe it will bear us to a place where we aren't separated by class or our inability to read or the voices that we hear at night. And in the meantime, it gives us somewhere warm to lay our heads.
Wow.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's a great piece.
Thank you.
And
yeah.
what happened to John? Have you maintained contact with him in the last few years?
I haven't. John was a deeply troubled individual. After I wrote that piece, one of the last times I saw him, I don't know. It was strange. He was. I think he was, to be frank. I mean, in retrospect, with the benefit of a lot more experience, I think John was a paranoid schizophrenic.
Mm-hmm.
He had a lot of really heavy experiences, both in his childhood, and he was, in the war. He was in Vietnam, and obviously carried a lot of that trauma with him. But he was a brilliant man, even though he didn't have a formal education. He was one of these people who had a sort of social genius that bordered on sort of the pathological. He had a way of getting inside your head, and by the time I finished that piece, I was having dreams about him. I mean, menacing dreams. He got under your skin in a way that was unhealthy. And so I after the last interview with him, I didn't go back, and I always felt a little bit guilty about it. But I didn't really know how to take him, and I hope he's well, but I haven't been back since. Initially I'd actually wanted to help him edit his poetry and try and get it published, because he had talent, and a real original talent. He was not, he didn't have any formal education, and because of that, his work was original. He had a very original perspective, and I think, probably could find some success with the right, the right help.
Yeah.
But, I just, I couldn't deal with it at the time.
No, well, that's a lot to deal with, especially as young as you were when you were doing these interviews. And, it brings to mind something that's been on my mind a little bit, and, excuse me. Sorry about that. It reminds me a little bit of the S-Town podcast. Have you listened to that at all?
Oh, yeah, I listened to it all. It was
yeah.
Great work.
And I say the character, the person of John B. and then the John you wrote about.
He's a hell of a guy.
Yeah, and there's these interesting just people that pop up in various places and places you wouldn't expect them who have that, whether it comes from a mental disturbance or from just their own personality as they're built or whatever. They have this thing about them where they have these demons. They wake up and they fight every day, and they either win the fight or they don't. But either way, they distill that, if you want to call it emotion, trauma, whatever it is, they distill that into some form of artistic expression. And you don't meet them often, but when you do, something in you just knows, and you know you're dealing with this force contained in a human being that will never be quantified, but is something very, very unique. And it's really thrilling when you meet someone like that. Like I'm still recovering a little bit. Like that was one hell of a story.
Yeah.
And it was one hell of a person.
Yeah, no, it was I enjoyed getting to know John. And I've thought often about going back since I moved back to the area and revisiting him. I don't even know if he's still around. But yeah, interesting fellow for sure.
Yeah. Well, man, I'm not really sure we can improve on that. That was an incredibly moving story. And I know we had some other topics that we wanted to get to. We wanted to delve a little bit more into Arkansas for some of those awesome stories you have back there. But the way this one went, I am not displeased about it at all. But I feel like that story about John is its own stopping point. I feel like we should kind of leave it there and plan to come back again real soon and go a little bit deeper on some other stuff in the Ozarks.
Sounds good to me, man. Enjoyed it. Thank you.
Yeah, it's always good talking with you, Terry. Cool. Well, guys, we will catch you next time. Have a good night.